Hello and welcome to Inequality Talks, a podcast from the volunteers of the Economic Inequality Group at Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, Aarhus. My name is Chris. I am currently an intern with MS. With me today is Pelle Dragsted, an author and politician from the Red Green Alliance in Denmark. And full disclosure, Pelle and I has known each other for a while. And we invited Mr. Pelle Dragsted to give a speak about his new book, Nordisk Socialisme, or Nordic Socialism in English. And it's a book in which he lays out his views on how to further democratic control and civil ownership of the greater Danish and Nordic economy. So let's jump straight in.
Okay.
What inspired you to write the book?
Well, I've been thinking about the ideas of this book for many years. I think what I kind of wanted was to restart a debate about democratic socialism and about the democratization of the economy, not just as an utopian vision of a kind of future society, but also on a more practical level, discussing what kind of institutional, legal, political frameworks we can use to create or take the first steps in the direction of a more socialist economy. Because I think if we are really as kind of serious about a post-capitalist society, I think it's very important, especially in these times, that the left moves beyond kind of slogans and try to formulate more practical answers also to some of the hard questions. For example, if we don't want a capitalist class to own the means of production, who should own them and how should they own them? How should they be governed or stewarded? And also, of course, a question of how to distribute and allocate resources, the old discussion about market economy versus a planned economy and so on. So that's the main idea. I think in some ways my generation, I was born I began to be politically active around 89, when the so-called socialist countries collapsed, and the left have been very on the defensive for in almost my entire activist life. But in the last 10 years, just after the financial crisis and with this new movements, starting with Occupy Wall Street, the occupation of the squares in Southern Europe, Syriza, Podemos, Corbyn, Sanders. It's like the idea that socialist policies could rise to power is kind of not so distant anymore. And in some way, that forces us to, in my view, be more concrete, be more exact on what socialism means, in order to convince people that actually it's possible to move beyond capitalism. So in some ways, the book I have tried to pose all the hard questions to myself and to give what I hope people see as genuine answers in order to make socialism a more viable or attractive alternative. So you could say in a way it was also to clarify my own thoughts because, if socialism only is some kind of distant dream or distant pie-in-the-sky utopia, it's easy. But when you go to the more hard questions of how to organize this kind of economic non-exploitative activities and how to distribute goods and services and so on, it's become a little bit more complicated. And I think if we mean it seriously, and I do mean it seriously, I think we have to deliver answers. And my book is just a small contribution to that.
Yeah. Just a small contribution. Like it's a pretty long book. I read it yesterday. Maybe we should get more into it because you have written up 10 things to act upon to further Nordic socialism.
Yeah, that's the very end of the book.
That's in the very end of the book. So the 10 things he wrote, I will read up in Danish. Ekspander den demokratiske sektor, en moderne fondssocialisme. Tilbage til fællesskabet, et nyt demokratisk offentligt ejerskab. Et demokratisk tokammersystem i store selskaber, demokratisering af finanssektor og investeringer, jord og boliger som brugsværdi, ikke markedsværdi, datasocialisme, en fællesgørelse af offentlige goder, demokratisk donutplanlægning og sidst fuld beskæftigelse og offentlig jobgaranti. From your analysis, can you mention like the three most important actionable?
Yeah. Well, all the reforms basically is about making two things happen. One is to, in lots of different ways, to distribute and to democratize ownership in the economy, to our land, to companies, to different assets and infrastructure, data, intellectual property, all this kind of assets who are key in distributing wealth, but also distributing power in our economy and society. So I try to come up with ideas of how to organize ownership in a democratic way. So that's one of the one of two main tasks of my reform proposal. The other one is, you could call it, to replace market power with democratic decision making and stewardship. So if I could mention some very important issues in the two of these areas, I think, speaking of democratic ownership, I think we really need to make it a lot more easy to make the state institutions in some way support and lay the ground for much more democratic ownership based on our experiences, not least in the Nordic countries, of different kind of cooperative ownership. It could be, for example, giving workers right to buy when the company they work in shifts getting sold to a wealth fund or to some kind of asset manager, that they should be able to make a bid, and that there are financial support and also support in how to run a corporation or a company. But if you want me to mention just one, I think the ownership of the financial sector is, of course, very important, because not least because we are in the middle of the biggest crisis maybe for humanity ever, the sustainability crisis, you could call it, climate and biodiversity crisis. So the problem is that in order to avoid the catastrophe, we need to make giant redirection of investment in our society, in our economy. But the problem is that the decisions about investments, the most of the decisions are not taken in democratic forums. They're taken by oligarchs, people in banks or in asset managers that do not have any kind of democratic mandate. So one important step should be to form a broad network of public banking and public investment banking in order to make it possible for the democracy to take this kind of crucial decisions about the direction of the investment in the economy, to change the patterns of investment away from fossil industries and technologies and in the direction of all these kind of technologies that we need. So on the other level, about reducing market power, there's kind of two ways to do it. One is what you could call decommodification. It's a hard, complicated word, but explaining something very simple, that you convert services that was commodities and convert them to social rights. So, for example, in Denmark in the decades after the Second World War, we changed a lot of commodities into social rights. For example, elder care, healthcare, education. That people were, before they were dependent on their, what do you call it, købekraft, in order to access this kind of services. But in a way, you could say we took this quite great parts out of the market economy and changed them into social rights. And so that's one way. And you could imagine we could take further step. For example, just a proposal could be dental care, that in Denmark are, for some strange reason outside the social rights in our health system. You could talk about access to internet, Wi-Fi, maybe even housing. So that's one way of pushing a little bit the market more to the margins in our lives, so we can access the most important part of our needs without being dependent on our purchasing power. That's one way. In my book, I do not propose a kind of centralized planned economy. I think that the experiences from the Soviet Union and other of the so-called socialist regimes, that's a mild way of formulating it, very repressive and undemocratic societies. If we look more isolated at the economic models, the planned economy actually functioned quite well when the economies were simple, when they were producing tanks and electrification of the country. But in the 60s and the 70s, they were richer, and more of the production was, consumer products, because the purchasing power of the people were elevated. Then the economy became more and more complicated and more complex, and of course also with this kind of knowledge economy where the innovation and the knowledge in the products have played a more important role. It didn't function very well anymore. So I kind of reject the idea of a centralized planned economy. But what I do propose is that we should look at the discussion of market economy and planned economy in a new way. Instead of looking at it as a binary, that you have to choose between a market economy or a planned economy, we should look upon it as a continuum. I don't know if you can say that in English, kind of a spectrum, because that's a reality. If you look at real economies, there are none of them at the very extremes. There have never existed a total market economy, and actually a total planned economy have never existed either. So all economies are kind of placed inside this spectrum. So what I propose in my book is that we should take some great steps in the direction of more democratic planning, but without going to the extremes of the idea of, a centralized planning body. But I really think that in order to avoid the climate catastrophe, we have to do more democratic planning. The idea of just pricing, the neoclassical idea of trying to put a price tag on CO2 is what you call it, on carbon. And then the market kind of will fix it, because we kind of, as the economists would say, internalize externalities. But I don't think that will be functioning. I'm very supportive of a carbon tax, but the idea that the market can solve this alone is just naive. We have waited for that in 30 years, and so I think we need much more planning. For example, all scarce resources, we shouldn't use them for stuff that we don't need if they are needed for stuff that we really need. And in order to achieve that, we need more planning. So in my book, I propose a thing I call donut planning, inspired, of course, by Kate Raworth and her ideas about the donut economy, which is an economy that kind of exists and runs or lives inside certain boundaries. And I think the idea of a planned economy which aim is to make the economy run inside these boundaries is quite a good way of thinking democratic planning in a new way that is not this kind of centralized bureaucratized planning that we knew from the Eastern European countries. So it was not 2 or 3 simple steps, but more the direction that I want to go. And maybe we should talk a little bit about the theoretical foundation for these ideas, because maybe at least for some left-wingers, the idea of making a economy or society more socialist and less capitalist is kind of maybe provoking, or at least not the way we used to think about modes of production, because what we have taken from Marxism, and it's not quite true to what Marx really said or wrote. We have this idea of that capitalism is kind of a totality. So we live inside a capitalist society, a capitalist economy and a capitalist market, and socialism is something that will arrive after we have a kind of ended capitalism. But what I propose in the book, and that's a really central, theoretical starting point, is that in some way, as I said with the market economy and plant economy, that it's not a binary system, that in the reality, all countries or all economies are kind of mixed. So you have not just one mode of production. Of course, one mode of production will be dominant, but you have also other modes of production. I was actually inspired to this idea from an article I read maybe 25 years ago by two American feminists and Marxists. They wrote under the pseudonym Gibson Graham. One of them unfortunately died since, but they kind of challenged the idea of capitalism as a totality and tried to put attention to all the economic activities that happens outside capitalism. Of course, in the family, they were feminists, but also in co-ops, in family-driven companies, in the public sector, all places where goods and services are created, economic activities are taking place, but that are not exploitative and not extractive and are typically also democratically governed. Another scholar, Eric Olin Wright, also unfortunately died 1 year ago. He carried this idea through in his writing in his latest book. It's called How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. And it's the same idea of leaving this idea of this binary and accepting that Eric Olin Wright uses a picture kind of maybe it's not the best, but a biosphere where certain new species enters, and maybe they're just kept in the margins, but maybe in some they will expand themselves and eventually take over. So that's his idea of how to change an economic system, and that's more or less the same ideas that I have presented in my book. And I think this kind of way of understanding an economy is especially relevant to the Nordic countries because, as I maybe explained a little bit also before, big parts of our economies are, it's very difficult to just label them capitalist. Our public sector, for example, it's about every 3 in the working force that works in the public sector, and there are not any capital owners. The goods are not traded on a market. It's not oligarchic. It's a democratic system that governs in some way. Of course, there's lots of problems and lack of influence from workers and the citizens, but still, it's very different from a capitalist corporation that is oligarchic, that we have no democratic influence. And it's not just in the public sector, it's also in our long tradition for co-op ownership that evolved in Denmark and the Nordic countries from late 19th century. Grocery stores, or the farmers' movement that made their own dairy production, and our housing sector, where 1 of every 5 units today is owned by a cooperative, what we call almene boligforeninger, that is a direct ownership by the tenants, but collective ownership, not individual ownership. So in that way, this idea of trying to acknowledge that there exists something outside capitalism, not independent from capitalism, but outside capitalism, that is something different, and that this something different could be a starting point for the changes that we want to make.
Yeah, I actually wanted to expand on that with cooperative ownership or democratic ownership, because that is a thing we've excelled at here in the Nordics. Sadly, a lot of collectives have passed on the last 50 years, but especially the farmers movement and the farmers cooperative have proven to be really resilient. But also, they've turned kind of exploitative. Arla is not necessarily climate conscious. The big animal production cooperatives aren't necessarily good for the environment, good for the animals. How do we make sure in this transitional economy, how do you make sure that the cooperatives don't start acting as if they're in like a capitalist economy?
This is a very important question and very important point, and that have been the discussion on the left for more than 100 years. The German socialist or Polish socialist Rosa Luxemburg was very critical towards the idea of using cooperatives as a way to create socialism, because she said that the workers will just become their own slave. What do you call it? Slave driver. Yeah. So there are several answers to this question. First and foremost, of course, democratic ownership is not a guarantee of good decisions. People can make bad decisions, like in a political democracy, but it is a potential for making good decisions. And a lot of research have been done during the last decade showing that cooperatives and worker-owned cooperatives are quite resilient and do well also in a capitalist environment without lowering salaries or doing other kind of exploitative maneuvers. But I think the most important answer to this, and why, for example, Arla or other farmers' cooperatives are, because I totally agree, they can't be an argument for that, that democratic ownership leads to responsible decision making, because as you know, they have a big responsibility for our deteriorating water quality, for our oxygen iltsvind in our seas, etc. And you could ask, why would a farmer pollute where his kids go to swim, for example? I think it's not kind of this. They find it a very good idea that when the kids go to swim, that the fishes are laying with the bottom up. So, of course, we have to ask ourselves, why do they act in this way? It's kind of intuitive, and that brings us to the other point of my book, the issue about the capital accumulation or the market economy, because the reason for this is that the Danish farming industry have been under tremendous competitive pressure, and in order to survive in a global market economy, they have just make these structural changes and this very, very, very exploitative way of doing farming. And of course, you could discuss if it was just a bad strategy, if they could have done otherwise, but they have done it this way. And therefore, I think it's very important to say that even if all major parts of the economy were converted into democratic ownership or co-ops, we wouldn't get rid of the problem of the negative consequences of market economy, because if they have this really hard competition, they externalize. It's a logic consequence of this way of organizing the allocation of goods and services. There are also other negative consequences, like business cycle, that you have recurrent crisis where a lot of unemployment was really crazy part of capitalist economy or market economy, that you have people who could produce goods and services that are just kept home just because it's not profitable, or because there aren't any private capitalists who want to employ them. So there's a lot of negative consequences. So for me, it's very important to say that the democratization, of course, is key to creating a socialist economy, because some say, no, but it's not socialism just to democratize. It's still capitalism. Then I ask, okay, but then it's capitalism without capitalists. It's kind of a little bit crazy capitalism. But I agree that in order to achieve our goals, we should discuss not only ownership, but also the distributional system or the market economy and the planned economy. So in order to avoid the Arla experience, you could say.
Yeah. A point you don't expand that much on in your book are big trade agreements or the EU. Because right now you're talking about external pressures. How can we in the Nordic mitigate those pressures coming from outside?
Yeah.
Because that's, I think, the biggest vehicle for like the exploitation of our environment, lowering workers' pays. Do you have like any idea on how to fix the EU and world market economy?
As you said, it's not a discussion I expand in the book, and I'm very, I declare that in the start of the book that it's kind of course, I try to describe how we could develop our own economy in a democratic way, and of course that is an abstraction because at least the most radical proposal that I make for taking over big companies by the workers, that would, of course, in a global economy, if we were the only country who did that, lead to capital flight, or the companies would just move on. So some of the more radical proposals would only be possible if it was something that happened in several countries and maybe in bigger countries like the US or the UK or Germany, some of the main economies, or of course on an international level, if the EU, for example, it's hard to imagine, but took a decision to democratize big companies. Maybe you noticed that half a year ago there was a discussion actually in the EU, and they proposed a more workers' representation in companies, and also the Danish Employers Federation that just went crazy. It was how can the EU suggest this? This is communism and so on. So I think they will be able to stop these kind of initiatives, But when that is said, a lot of what I'm proposing we could initiate tomorrow, because one of my ways of working with this book is trying to take experiences that already function in other European countries or in the US or in Canada or other places, and then propose that we do the same thing. For example, Germany has a public bank. Half of the German population have the public banks as a main bank. In Britain, you have special tax schemes for if you sell your company to the workers, you have some benefits, and all these kind of ideas we could just need to. The idea of creating democratic ownership fund to buy up land instead of letting capital wealth managers buy up our land. That's they're doing really quickly in this year. So a lot of things we could start tomorrow. But of course, if we really want to change the what you call the relation of forces, it had to be on an international level, and therefore we have to do more to organize with our friends and movements and socialists from other parts of the world. And the other issue, of course, also is that even if we succeeded in a democratic economy in our part of the world, we would still be a part of a really unjust international trading system with the unequal exchange with the global south. But I think that in a democratic economy, without this kind of oligarchic power, without this kind of forced accumulation that we have in our big corporation today, I think it would be a lot easier for us to agree on more just trading policies with the global south also. But in some way you could say that my book is a little Eurocentric. It takes its starting point at least in our own countries, and that's because that's where we do the struggle and where we have had all our successes as a labor movement throughout the years. So, but of course, it's a major task and a major challenge to try to organize a lot more cross-border among the working class in broader sense.
Cool. You basically started on my last question, which was which practices could Nordic countries be inspired by further away? And maybe I was thinking what you said about not trying to do socialism during capitalism. But I was thinking what is your thoughts about prefiguration? Trying to make socialist institutions that promote the socialist way. Kind of like what the syndicalists did for example, in Spain, where they tried to do workers' communities, and that was actually how they got themselves loose and how they transformed the economy for a very short while.
Yeah, you could say that I draw from the same ideas and maybe even traditions, because that's the main idea. The main idea or point of my book is that we don't have to start from scratch. That in some kind we already created some institutions, and of course they're not perfect. Institutions will never be perfect, but they show us our co-op sector, in the housing sector, in the our biggest grocery chain is a cooperative. We have worker cooperative also, not so much in Denmark as in other European countries, and they function. And they every day they are proof that you can organize economic enterprise in ways that are not exploitative and that are democratically governed, and where you don't have capital owners who take up the wealth, and where you don't contribute to this kind of oligarchic power that the capitalist system all the time creates by concentrating wealth in among a small elite of capital owners. So what I think the left has been, maybe a failure of the left, have been to try to the idea of socialism as some kind of only utopian vision of something that we built from scratch after a revolution. So the idea is that, and that's the idea of the term Nordic Socialism, is to acknowledge that we already have, building blocks, and we have experiences that we can use and that we can expand in order to reduce the power of capital and the power of markets. Step by step, and of course, I'm not naive. I know that there are strong interests and strong elite groups that will oppose this kind of ideas. It's not kind of I'm not a total Bernsteinist. It's not a kind of evolutionary, non-contradictory process. It will be a lot of struggle and a lot of conflict, of course. But I think the idea that socialism is something that we already know from our, public hospitals, our libraries, our højskoler, I don't know what it's called in English, all from your activities in MS, all places where we organize activities in economies without capitalists, basically. So that's the main point. Then you ask if I'm inspired from other parts of the world. It's very important for me to say that the idea of Nordic socialism doesn't mean that it's kind of this would only function in the Nordic countries. It's not kind of culturalist in any way. It's just I took the term from Donald Trump, who used it in a report talking about Nordic socialism. I found it funny that, and I liked the term, so I took it as a title for my book. But it's not a culturalist idea. I think it just has to do with, because of certain historical circumstances, the correlation of forces in the Nordic countries have been in the favor of the working class for some years, and also because of the presence of the farmers' movement in the 19th century and all the co-op experience that came out of this. But actually, in my book, I mostly find inspiration on the European level, because we have co-ops in Denmark, but if you visit, for example, the Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, the density of cooperative is much more, it's a higher density of cooperative. The same could go for the Basque country with famous worker-owned cooperative like Mondragon, which is the fifth employer in Spain with more than 80,000 worker owners. But actually, if you really want to find a cooperative density, then you should go to the Indian region of Kerala. I don't remember the numbers, but it's a really high density of cooperative. And of course, also in Latin America, Asia, Africa, there are lots of experiences in organizing economy in non-capitalist way. Also, of course, in more indigenous communities. And actually, you could also go to some of the market-oriented society, like, for example, Singapore. We think about it as, very capitalist society, but the state owns all lands and nearly all housing, and have been able in that way to hold down prices. So there's a lot of experiences from all over the world that we could, of course, pick up and use. And we can contribute with some experiences from the Nordic countries, but I'm sure that from other parts of the world that would be the same. It's the universal idea that capitalism is not alone, that there is an outside. And for me, this idea of an outside capitalism and, that we have some building blocks is kind of, for me, it's kind of radical because it gives us the possibility to start to create socialism, not just, wait for it till after the revolution.
Cool. Is there anything you think we've forgotten or anything you'd like to add?
Read the book.
I did, but yeah.
But it haven't come out in English. But I could say that there are some articles, for example, in the British magazine Tribune, and there are also coming an article soon in Jacobin. So I really hope that the book will come out in English as well. My publisher is working on it, but we haven't had success yet.
So yeah, last question. On an actionable level for like the ordinary citizen, what is one thing they could do right now?
I think they can use the democratic spaces that are available. For example, most Danish workers, they are part of a pension fund organized through their union. And actually, there have been some very interesting movement. I think MS have also in some way taken part in organizing workers to take over the leadership in order to, for example, de-invest in fossil fuels. But we could take that much further. We could say we want actually our pension savings to be used more in order to achieve goals, not only to, to not invest in something, but to decide we want to invest especially in this kind of activities. That's also a way of democratizing the decision of investment. But it's also to be active in your grocery store, to be active in your energy co-op. Lots of the energy infrastructure in Denmark is cooperatively owned, and it's important that we use this space. Of course, as I think Oscar Wilde he said, I have been told at least, that the problem about socialism is that there's too few evenings in the week to all this meeting that we have to attend. So of course we need to prioritize and to make some kind of representative structures. But I think the most important thing is to acknowledge that actually we do have economic power in certain extent if we organize together and use our collective democratic power in these institutions. We could start today or tomorrow.
Thank you so much for coming in. It was a real pleasure.
A pleasure for me as well.
Details of the book will be in the notes for this episode. Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke is a Danish NGO that works for a more just and sustainable world. Here in Aarhus, we have over 100 volunteers working together to run a not-for-profit cafe and campaign and educate in areas ranging from feminism and climate justice to anti-discrimination and economic inequality to queer issues and refugees' rights. You can come down to Café Mellemfolk every day, but Sunday for food, drinks, and events in a cozy cafe. You can also get involved with our events, activities, and campaigns, and even running the cafe as a volunteer yourself. So go on and check out our Instagram, Facebook to find out more by looking up Café Mellemfolk or Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke Aarhus, or following the links in the episode notes. And check out our Podbean, YouTube, and other podcast providers for more episodes, interviews, and cool stuff. Thank you everyone for listening, and until next time, goodbye.